Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Matissio. I'm the director and chief curator of the Blaffer Art Museum, and I'm the artistic director of the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center for the Arts. And I'm so pleased to welcome you to the performance this evening. But I have to admit that it is with bittersweet emotions that I introduce this performance, because it is now only 3 days left of the Nick Vaughan and Jake Margolin exhibition at the Blaffer Wayfinding. So if you have not seen it yet, please go see it. If you have seen it, please see it again, and a second and a third time. It is certainly worth your while. It has just been such a privilege and honor to work with Nick and Jake. And so before I introduce the performance, I just want to give a few thank yous. First of all, to our sponsors, Nancy Hickson, Beverly Murphail, and Kevin Coolish. We greatly appreciate the support that you have provided for this show. And I also have to give a huge thanks to the Mitchell Center, who very much provided the financial support and the backing for the performance, the painting performance, as well as the performative lectures that have very much animated this exhibition. And really, the performances animate so many of the elements that are present in this exhibition. And if you've seen it, you've seen how the way that wayfinding very much revolves around this series of wind drawings that Nick and Jake have created originally for the 50 States Arkansas project, but have now expanded this body of work to very much sort of reflect back on 10 years of where 50 states have led, where it has taken them, and in a lot of ways capturing the spirit of this project in a way that it embeds the fibers of the story into a substrate, and yet things are fragile and fleeting and ephemeral. So very much capturing the spirit of this project and of this exhibition. And so, again, with a heavy heart, because it means that the show is almost over, but with great anticipation, I am so pleased to welcome you tonight and to introduce Nick Vaughan and Jake Margolin. Please welcome Nick and Jake.
Is it going now? Now it's going. We just want to do a quick round of thank yous to everybody at the Blaffer for making all of this possible. It's been like just such a wonderful crew on every front. I'm going to miss people because I didn't write things down. But Stephen and Susanna and Colleen and Young Min and Rob and Blanco and everyone. It's just been like really great being here. And we're sort of sad to see it come to an end too. And thank you all for being here, and thanks for the folks who've joined us tonight and are going to participate. And I think with that, we'll get started. Because there was no wind, the smoke of your letters hung in the air for a long time, and its shape was the shape of your face. We read a poem to our 3-year-old before bedtime every night. We have this lovely book with all these nature-based acrostics, each one with a word like willow or raven, that was edited out of the Oxford Youth Dictionary to make room for new words like selfie. It's called Lost Words, and we've been reading it for years. We've probably been through the whole collection 30 times now, and so it was a few months ago that we were talking to a friend, Anna Godberson, about needing to find some new poems to add into the rotation. She pulled a book from her shelf, not so much poems written for kids, but poems that were kid accessible. And I started flipping through it. The first page I stopped on by chance, so far as chance is a thing, was this Amy Lowell poem, A Burnt Offering. Now, I'm not very good with names, and I'm not terribly well versed in early 20th century poets, so the name Amy Lowell didn't mean anything to me, or Jake for that matter. Anyhow, I stumbled across this poem, and then what happened is what not infrequently happens between the two of us, which is my historical gaydar went off, and I said something like, well, that is certainly a queer poem. She must have been a lesbian. And then Jake was like, no, wait just a minute. We should at least look her up, because he's careful like that. And we did. and she was clearly a lesbian. And moreover, is one of the most respected queer poets of the early 20th century, which made us both feel a little dumb for not knowing or recognizing her name. There was a little flicker of memory as we were reading her Wikipedia page. Anyhow, all of this is to say that those 5 lines in some way encapsulate not only our approach to the drawings that we're ostensibly here to talk to you about tonight, but a fair amount of our broader practice. Because there was no wind, the smoke of your letters hung in the air for a long time, and its shape was the shape of your face. A Burnt Offering, published in 1919.
We've spoken a fair amount over the years about how much of our history was lost to flame, to folks covering their own tracks, disposing of incriminating evidence, love letters and journals and photos. Sometimes if it wasn't someone destroying their own records, it was a concerned family member, or a sibling, or a parent, or a cousin, keeping the family safe from the scandal and the judgment that might fall upon them should the secret of their lifelong bachelor relation see light. But Lowell is suggesting something very different here. Its shape was the shape of your face. The burning of the letter, while it may destroy the artifact, the ephemera, the record that 100 years later Nick and I are going to be digging through archives and personal papers trying to find, to no avail. It doesn't destroy the actual thing. It is in burning the letter that her lover's face becomes manifest in the smoke that billows out, that finds its way into her lungs, into our lungs, and that merges with vapor and rains back down, that condenses on walls as inky soot, a mark, a memory. We're here to talk about chasing down burned memories. Largely, though not only, the memories that led to the 50 States Arkansas piece that started us on the wind drawings in the first place. But first we wanted to diverge for just a moment and tell you a little bit about this person. This is JJ Farmer, to be exact. It took us a few months and a chain of people to figure it out. All we had to go on was a portfolio of some 8x10 prints of photographs by Nick's aunt, Janice Rubin, taken in the backyard of Marries Naturally in 1976. JJ was an amateur queen. He never played the big stages, but God, he was so full of life and punk spirit. And there's another photograph from that portfolio that we've used where he's holding a cigarette and he's yelling at the camera with a little bit of a smirk. And for years, Nick and I remembered that image as the one of JJ flipping the camera off, which he wasn't doing. But it was just this amazing vibe. Sometimes things are true in spirit, if not in fact. Anyway, we built another body of work around JJ, and we created another performance lecture called A Landing on the Bayou. It's a talk that we performed at Devon Borden Gallery and at Michael's Outpost and at the Alley Theater. And it's about the importance of queens and their centrality to the politics and the culture and the well-being of our community. Something that you all should know is that we never finish projects. A few weeks ago, we went back up to Arkansas to chase down some potential leads on our Arkansas piece, the one that premiered in 2019. But while we were back up there chasing down these memories, we got to interview Martin Tuller, who's here tonight, who we knew was friends with 2 of the most famous queens in the scene, Hot Chocolate, whose boy name is Larry Edwards, and Naomi Sims, whose boy name was Newman Broad. And we were ostensibly there to talk about Arkansas and our Arkansas piece, but like everything we touch, it went a little sideways and it looped back into A Landing on the Bayou. And it's not exactly one-to-one, but something about it feels important for tonight too. And of course, now we've got to revisit A Landing on the Bayou and fold all of this back in.
Well, we were living in an apartment complex just a few blocks from the Copa. I don't think the Copa had been open for very long. Sunday shows were a regular thing for a lot of the gay community in Houston. I've often talked about the impact that drag culture had on the gay community at that time, but it was always a safe place, a safe space, where we didn't have to worry about if someone was following us or if we were going to get gay bashed, but it was so close to home, and it was the biggest bar for shows at the time. The old plantation was still in existence for a short while during my first year there, but they eventually closed, and Hot Chocolate was performing at the old plantation initially, and we met him through another friend. And so some Sundays, Old Plantation did their show earlier than the Copa. We would go both places. And then when the Old Plantation closed was when Larry went to work for the Copa. And at that point, I think the popularity of that stage, that bar, and those queens, it was packed every week. But, you know, for years and years here, and I'm sure in other smaller cities or larger cities, even at the Copa, there weren't the age barriers that exist now. And there was a lot more camaraderie among generations. And there was a respect for those who had paved the way that I think's missing. And like I said, I think that's sad. I'm glad to know that there are young people like you and Jason Carr. You know, Jason never even met Naomi. But something about him and that time touched Jason to a point that he felt compelled to preserve that history. And that's an honorable thing in my book. Because without those sanctuaries that those spaces provided us, I don't know that we would have made it through the AIDS crisis in the manner in which we did. I do think, though, that and I've had gay men disagree with me on this. Without the AIDS epidemic and what the culture witnessed in the bonds that were formed by the millions of gay men who were touched by this, I mean, some people going to 10, 12 funerals a week, I'm not sure that we would have gotten to full equality without that.
A community forged in fire and loss. I want to tell you a ghost story. In 1926, a white man named Wellington Stevenson became the president of the Missouri and North Arkansas Railway, and he moved with his African-American lover, a man named Jesse, to the small town of Harrison, Arkansas. The two lived together in a converted luxury rail car, car number 99. Jesse was ostensibly a live-in servant, an arrangement unheard of not only because of its same-sex dynamic and the exceedingly close quarters, but because Harrison, Arkansas had, only 20 years earlier, violently expelled its entire African-American population, becoming one of the region's notorious sundown towns, and later a haven for self-proclaimed leaders of the white supremacist movement. We know that 7 years after moving into their opulent rail cars, Stevenson and Jesse were run out of town when the MNNA hit financial turmoil. We know that Stevenson, a confirmed bachelor into his late 50s, retired to Kansas City, where he lived with a wife, a widow with several grown children, in a development with deed restrictions that excluded black residents. We know that Jesse disappears from the historical record. We haven't even found his last name. For the first time since we started our 50 States project, we have not been able to find a definitive paper trail to document the relationship at the center of this piece. As concrete evidence, we have nothing more than the assertions of a few historians who conspicuously choose not to cite their sources, and the not-so-coded language of century-old newspaper reports. After 2 years of research, we realized that this is not the stuff of archival history, and that we find ourselves deep in the territory of folklore. But we did spend a lot of time in archives across the state of Arkansas searching. We learned that the number 99 had originally been built in 1888 for the Colorado Midland Railroad as a luxury car called the Manitou. In the Boone County Historical Society, we found photographs of the car in its heyday, and a 1970 photograph of the car in retirement in Kensett, Arkansas, on cinder blocks with a stack of old tires, a private residence / glorified trailer. We went to Kensett on the other side of the state, and we drove down every street holding a printout of this photo, hoping that we could find it. The only business that was open was a Mexican restaurant, and the staff didn't live in town and had never seen the Manitou before. We saw a middle-aged man and an old man fixing a fence, and we asked the middle-aged man, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember that thing. It was right over next to Charlie Johnson's house. There was an old lady who lived there. I'm not sure what happened to her. She probably died." And I asked if they could show me where it was, and the middle-aged man told the old man to take us over, but said, "It's not there anymore. I don't know what happened to it." The old man took us a few blocks over. He had to look at the photo a lot and try to figure out which overgrown lot it was. He figured it out. It was overgrown. There was an old lady in the yard across the way, and I said to the old man that I was going to ask her, and he said, "Sure, you can do that. The man who lives there is in a wheelchair. He might know something." And he went back to his fence, and I went across the street, and I showed the old woman the picture, and she said, "Never seen that." And I said, "Well, it used to be in that lot right there." And she said, "Must have been before my time. I just take care of the man who lives here." And I said, "Can I ask him if he remembers what happened to it?" And she said, "No." So we went back to the fence crew, and we asked if they knew anyone who knew a lot about railroads around here, and they said no, not in Kensett. And then the middle-aged guy's wife, who was also there now, said, "What about that guy up in Bald Knob?" And they all agreed that we should go ask the guy in Bald Knob. He has some kind of a museum, and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, he has a train out there. It might be that one. So we went to Bald Knob, where there was indeed a small amateur railroad museum in an abandoned train depot. And there was this wooden skeleton of an old train car on its rusted carriage, the beauty of the steam-bent wood evident through the ravages of the elements. And I photographed it, and I imagined you in your car, Jesse. And we went to the door of the depot, and there was a piece of printer paper on the window saying, "We are closed for the Jacksonville Model Train Show." So we went to Jacksonville, and we saw our first model train exposition filled with people who love train expositions. And eventually we found the table for the folks from Bald Knob, and I showed the guy who looked like he ran the place the photograph, and he pointed me to the guy who actually ran the place, and I showed him the photograph, and he said, "Oh, that's the Manitou, the number 99. Did you know those letters used to be written in real 24-karat gold?" And I said, "I did know that." And I asked, "Is that it outside of the depot?" And he looked at me like I was an idiot, and he said, "That skeleton? No." And I asked if he knew where it went after Kensett, and he said, "Absolutely. I think an old lady was living in it. And I'm not sure if she died or what, but it got bought by a couple of railroad guys up in Fort Smith, and they completely redid it back to its original glory. They spent a mint. They really did it. And just when they finished, they had it parked in a rail yard, and somebody decided to torch it. Just burnt it to the ground." I asked if the chassis was still around somewhere, and he said, "I'm sure it's been scrapped." We can't find any record of the arson in any newspaper archives. The man who was in charge of the Bald Knob operation at one point had offered to put us in touch with one of the guys who had been restoring it. But when we reached back out and asked him to do it, it turned out that his contact there had some advanced dementia, and he didn't think it would be a good idea to contact him, which felt okay. It's not like they were going to tell us that A 108-year-old ghost of a man named Jesse came back and claimed ownership and burned it when they wouldn't give him what was rightfully his. The man who runs the museum in Bald Knob also told us at the Jacksonville Model Train Show that he had the pay ledgers for the MNNA for the years when Stevenson was president. We thought perhaps we would find Jesse's last name in there. So we planned to go back and look. And then the pandemic hit and we didn't go to Bald Knob. And then 2 weeks ago, we decided that we needed to try, and so that maybe, just maybe, we could find Jesse's last name before giving this talk. So we drove up to Bald Knob, but the pay ledgers that they have are from a decade later. Incidentally, the man who runs the operation in Bald Knob is in the middle of a war with the City Council of Bald Knob, desperately trying to preserve historical buildings that the council has decided are eyesores and need to be replaced by new construction. When all is said and done, what we actually know without a shadow of a doubt, is that the number 99 was reduced to ash. Ash is the remnant of fire. Charcoal is the remnant of a fire that has been starved of oxygen. Or maybe it's better to think of it as a fire that's been kept under wraps, hidden away, protected from the elements. Pyrolysis, which is the word for producing charcoal, is the process of purification. It's like some kind of rite or ritual, the elevation of material to its most efficient, essential self. Charcoal is the remnant of a fire that has been starved of oxygen. Either way, combustion or pyrolysis, ash or charcoal, there's going to be smoke. A mix of particles and gases escaping from the burning material, mixing with the air. We may not have found the 99, but we've been to Fort Smith, and I am quite sure that we've breathed a bit of it in. I'm going to take back what I said just a second ago. We can't prove that the 99 was burned. We know it, but we can't prove it, like so much else in our history. Right as we were starting out on the 50 States project, a friend asked us if we were making histories or making ballads. And we had a knee-jerk reaction and answered instantly, histories, but artfully. And as time has gone on, without losing an ounce of the passion for finding the paper trails and the deeds and the marriage licenses and the artifacts, I think we're getting more comfortable working in that in-between place and recommitting ourselves to the ballad. Tales of what we know but we can never prove. We've been working on our Arkansas piece for a number of years now. It's not done. We haven't even really begun working on the final performance lecture for it, which we're envisioning as a large theatrical event with live music and performers, built in collaboration with LGBTQIA+ folks all over Arkansas. We've only just begun collecting those ballads, those unprovable knowns. Here's one.
Well, actually, now that you say that, I don't know his name. I can't think of it off the top of my head. But he was a well-known English writer who actually settled some land here. And the speculation is that he was gay, and he entertained a lot of very well-known literary figures for the time here in Fayetteville.
Here's another one. This is from Jasmine Terrell, who's the drag mother of one of our frequent collaborators, Josie Lee Terrell, who we've managed to convince to work with us on a number of projects, including 50 States Oklahoma, 50 States Colorado, and Political Gestures.
Yes, actually, there is one. There is, of course, this was, like I said, I've heard stories, in the 80s or whatever. Like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a bar owner, his name was, you can Google it, it was Tim's Playroom. And this was a bar owner that was, that done drag. And it was the Fortune Park. It was a park in Tulsa that was like a cruising spot or whatever. Well, he won Miss Gay Tulsa like, I think like early 80s. And like 6 months later, they found him like at a park. He was known for cruising or whatever. And they found him at a park uh, with his thing cut off and like shoved in his mouth or whatever. And I've heard that. Well, you can Google that too. It's in there too. That but they said the person that done it was the person that was first. They got first run up to him or whatever. But they not living there or anything. But
To date, we've only gotten 2 of these recorded interviews done. There are dozens more to do, but in the meantime, here are 7 more that we hope people will tell us. Nobody has told us these things. Or if they did, they didn't elaborate. Yet. 1. We hope that an old-timer in a gay bar in Eureka Springs will tell us about how he always heard that Winthrop Rockefeller, once the governor of Arkansas, was in a lifelong relationship with the foreman of his property. 2. We hope that a queer kid living in the streets of Fayetteville will tell us that he started riding freight trains because he'd heard that on the rails nobody cared, and that you could find an older man who knew the ropes who would take you under his wing. 3. We hope that a lady whose kid died during the AIDS crisis will tell us about how she told her son that he wasn't welcome in her house anymore, and that she heard that some lady in Fort Smith took him in, and so many others, and cared for him and buried him, and that she will take us to where she thinks he might have been buried. 4. We hope that we'll hear about the lesbians who ran a gay bar out of the back of their house in the mountains, the kind of place whose address was listed in the Gaia guides as drive 16 miles down highway such and such and ask a local, and about how it was burnt to the ground. Or maybe they burned it down for the insurance money. 5. We hope we'll hear about the gospel choir in a long-gone church. 6. We hope we'll hear about how someone always knew their parents were gay, but it wasn't until their deathbed that they plucked up the courage to ask, but by then it was too late to find out. 7. We hope that someone will write a ballad about what they heard went down on the Delta plantations in antebellum Arkansas. I want to tell you something that an old-timer told me, but I don't know how to tell it, because I don't know if he's publicly out. And the details that made what he said sing so hard would pretty much give away who he is. But he told me over coffee in his kitchen out in the mountains, in talking about the act of digging through unknown histories, following leads to tell the stories that others would prefer to burn, of being a true dilettante and amateur participant anthropologist. He said with a devilish smile, "This isn't work for straight people, and I have never felt so proud to be family." And it's not the only story that we can't tell you, that we know is true. Things people told us that make so many things make sense but can't be repeated. Even if we didn't attribute them, they could be traced back. They could implicate people, because folks still gotta work. And the world we live in is still the world we live in, and folks still gotta live in this world. I was gonna write Arkansas is still Arkansas, but I don't think that's fair, because I don't think it's any different anywhere else. Oh, but there are a lot of great stories that we can tell. And here's one of local interest while we stand on the UH campus. We had asked Martin if there were any kind of LGBTQ student life on campus when he was a student.
There was none. I mean, there was a lot of activity in bathrooms on the campus that nobody talked about. It was very interesting to take a sociology class, I'll never forget, from a woman named Sheila Scheinberg. And there was a whole section on that type of activity. And it was going on in the bathroom right across the hall from the classroom. But you didn't talk about stuff like that on campus, at least I didn't.
Let's get technical for just a moment. These drawings over there in that building, these drawings are prints, footprints, fingerprints. They're almost antithetical to the printing process. They're sort of unprints. We sifted through folders and albums, file boxes stacked neatly or sometimes not so neatly in cabinets in historical societies. And we chased shadows with our camera, walking grounds long abandoned, visited old haunts. We turned those photographs into huge stencils, shadows of shadows, two-tone, two-dimensional, black and white oversimplifications, through which we dusted charcoal powder using a little screen tea diffuser. It was very civilized. With immense care, we lifted each stencil off, trying our best not to disturb the delicate images that we had reproduced. In this moment, the photographs are very clear. They're sharp-edged, focused. They have clean contours. And they're quite lovely in this state, and they're easy to read, but it's short-lived. Using an air compressor, which is such a poetic tool, forcing the atmosphere, the very air we breathe, into a stiflingly tight red tank, ready to release its contents with immense energy. Using this air compressor, we blew the charcoal away, obliterating the clean lines, the focus, the clarity. It's sort of an act of erasure. We still don't know Jesse's last name. But the thing is, it's the parts of the paper where the charcoal wasn't. The untouched, unmarked, undusted spots that record the action. The erasure actually inscribes the image into the tooth of the paper in a way that the dusting never could. And I think maybe in a way that is just maybe a little bit more right than the hard-focused accuracy of the photographs that we started with. There's always a question when we deal with these histories as to how much we should or shouldn't relate to historical experience through our contemporary queer lens. Whether that's about terminology or perceived identity, like the sort of Foucault thought that there weren't homosexuals before it was an identified classification, that there was just the behavior. I think I've often read that argument as some kind of historical prohibition. Without a language for it, it didn't exist. As some kind of inflexible decree. But years ago, when we were talking with Andy Campbell, who is here as a core fellow, he reframed that particular argument like this. Framing these experiences through our contemporary lens actually limits and cuts off the possibility, the breadth, the potential for a kind of society or understanding or identity that, unencumbered as it is by our current classifications and definitions, is always out of reach. And maybe, as a result, it's a little more magical or poetic or mythological. The incapacity to name it is actually part of its beauty. I don't know. I've been thinking about Jesse and Stevenson recently, and what was that relationship? Romance as I would understand it? Or something else from the wide experience of queer family making? Something from the sadder, more troubled dynamics that can come with family, or some combination of all of it. I think there's something about the kinds of family and community that are forged in tragedy or loss, in repression, in secrecy, that makes for these extraordinary relationships. Incidentally, Martin and his late husband Scott were known around Houston as Ma and Pa, first by Larry and Newman, and then by others, because they had this very stable relationship, and they often had the queens over for family dinner. And I love the idea that they were parents in this context. And then, at the same time,
Newman and Larry, they were both such prominent figures in the gay community that it was a different kind of mentoring. I did drag myself a few times. I was in the Miss Gay Houston pageant twice, and Naomi was my drag mother. But that's kind of a different form of mentoring.
it's a pretty astonishing kind of flexibility. Parent to child and back again. Let's stick with drag parents for a moment. Here's Jasmine again.
A drag parent is someone not only drag, but like to, financial support, like not just an ear, you know, someone to listen to everything. You know, like Josie, you know, she's, you know, I've been her drag parent. Like I told you how we met and everything, you know, and she, you know, talked to me about her relationships and, you know, every conversation is not just about drag, you know, like if she have a bill, you know, coming, you know, we help each other. That's what a drag parent is, you know, to be there for someone, not gossiping. And of course, everybody knows Josie. She loves the Facebook, you know, gossip. But you know, I'm the one that's like, okay, just stay off Facebook. But she's hard-headed, you know. She just loves Facebook. 'Cause I have had drag mothers, like yeah, I had like a couple of them like that I looked up to, and like they taught me like the stages of like makeup and you know like you know like padding and you know stuff like that. And it was probably it's like three or four that I looked up to, and they it was from Oklahoma. The one she passed away, her name is Destiny Foster, and she was from Oklahoma City, and she um she was the first entertainer that I knew of that how can I say this? That left early, you know,
And left early, in case you hadn't caught it, meant fell victim to HIV/AIDS. Jasmine couldn't come down tonight. She lives in Little Rock. She's probably performing at Discovery in a couple of hours. But she gave us permission to offer a photograph of Destiny Foster into the fire.
and Destiny was the kind of person she would take anything, and like she did. I don't. This was a popular song when I came over, but it was like the tribal dance. I mean, she come out like with all these tribe like dancers, and she did pageants, and she just made it where, of course, thinking back in the days, you know, they say a bunch of pageants was rigged and everything, but you have to gamble. You know, she would make it work. Oh, if it's rigged, well, what I'm bringing to the stage, it ain't no way you're gonna rig it. You know, and like, she was amazing, and like she hand sewed her stuff, and she was another person that of course I was underage, and I would just go to the bar to see like what she's getting ready to take into the bar, you know, because it was just, you know, it was amazing. And I met, like, it was the first funeral I went to, you know, when she passed away. And speaking of her, like, um, I have a good friend of mine. She lives in Arizona. She was from Oklahoma. Her name is Mia Adams. Mia had a car. I was living in Midwest City, Oklahoma. Destiny called and said she needed a ride to her mom's house. And actually, Mia and Destiny was cousins, first cousins. And we, me and Mia was going to the mall, and then we went to Destiny's house, and we took her to her mom's house, and then like the next day, we found that she passed away in her mom's arms. Yeah.
In addition to the vast knowledge of padding and makeup and technique, I think the most striking thing to me about drag parentage is just the oral tradition, the passing down of stories and culture. This is a story that Jasmine told from her drag mother's drag mother.
Yes, actually, I'm not gonna say, but I know her good friend was not Destiny, Jacqueline Devereaux. She's a former Miss Gay America, but she's living in Texas and her kids and everything. But yeah, it was Jacqueline Devereaux. And going back, speaking like Destiny used to tell me, Jacqueline. This is the story that I heard. Jacqueline Devereaux is from Tulsa, and she competed for. This is all over Facebook. She competed for Miss Oklahoma. Like, and I've seen videos and everything, and it ain't no way she didn't win a couple of times, but she was first runner up to Miss Oklahoma a couple of times, and one year she got second runner up, and so she went to I think, North Carolina, and she competed for North Carolina, and she won North Carolina, and went to Miss America, and won Miss America. So she competed for Miss Oklahoma like 4 or 5 times and never won Oklahoma. But the year she got second runner up to Oklahoma, she went to Miss America and of course beat the people that won Miss Oklahoma. And she came, this is sort of, I wasn't around it, but she came back and the Oklahoma promoters had to pay her because she was Miss America and everything. So she like, back in the days, I guess you could double your fee or whatever. And she like did songs like saying, like it was like a song like "Ah Goody, you didn't want me, but I Miss America," you know, stuff like that. Yeah. And I heard stories like they told her like before she won, like to get out, you know, to get out, go out the back door where you belong. Like on Facebook, he put some like, oh, the stories that I could tell, you know, and of course I put under somebody wrote, said I've heard stories too, and then of course I got on Facebook and I said, oh, I've heard some stories too, and Jacqueline said, well, for sure they true, you know, but she was a strong entertainer, and back then of course it was, she's still with her husband, you know, I guess he was, you know, he was white, and you know, I know she said it was hard back then living in Oklahoma, you know, in the 80s, you know, with that too. They still together, her and David.
We want to disperse a little more energy into the atmosphere, make a few of our histories a little more permanent, if less visible. So we've asked a few friends to bring offerings to our fire. Memories from someone whose smoke would do us good. We've asked them to say a little something, to give you just the tiniest window, and then we're going to make a little smoke. Roberto?
Roland Barthes wrote, "The tender gesture says, ask me anything that can put your body to sleep. But also do not forget that I desire you, a little, lightly, without trying to seize anything right away." I write to Jose Carlos again, or I would have written to Jose Carlos had he not left early. For days to situate the flesh, in whose inadequate precinct motionless, a monolith, of the often spoken of which nothing is certain and abstract, of whose gender to the use of all acknowledged desire, formal parlance and pronoun to form the stars across your back, whose hardened muscle, tremendous lateral delta of which to the shoulders, there's away from yes, the very inside an eternal tick of the left eye, a language not only illegible as the vain translation of a fictive contradictory self, and its consonant verb to be, but the body's crystal falling through a gray film of failed memory and brush fire this autumn midnight, to unfold in the form of your body pleasured corners of a place in which the difficult new breathing and I are foreigners.
Martin?
First of all, let me say how overwhelmingly grateful I am to be here tonight. So honored to have been included in this project. By the way, I was Paul, Scott was Maul. We first got together here in 1979 in Houston, but we're both originally from Northwest Arkansas. And we left here after 5 years together here. But over the course of the last 10 years, he fought cancer very bravely, and it brought us full circle back to Houston to MD Anderson Hospital. And through that journey of coming here so often for his cancer treatment, Houston really became a second home to us. We always managed to find time to make some new memories while we were here for cancer visits, so that it wasn't all about doctors and cancer. I lost him in December of this year after 43 years together. And all I'll say to you, Scott, is I'm never going to dance again the way I danced with you.
Allison?
I'm so touched and proud to have the opportunity to remember a very dear friend. Some of you may have known him, Michael Miller, who came here in 1986 to join the core program. We became very close friends thereafter, and when I lost my family, he became my family once again. The man I spent holidays with, who I did road trips with, and who enlarged my life in so many ways. On my 50th birthday, he sent me this card, actually a facsimile of this card. I'm not burning the original. Typical of his work, he added an L for my 50th birthday. And I once asked him, when he used words in his paintings, how did he work them into the composition? And he said, Allison, words are just lines with verbal skills. This is what he had to say with me then, and what I wish I could tell him again now. 50 say, till birthday, live at large, sugar, live at large. Much love to you, my friend, Allison. Hugs and kisses too. Love, Michael? Huh? Indeed. Michael Miller, I love you.
Kuma?
I was hoping you'd get a shot in. That's what he told me when we reconnected when I was an adult. Mr. Z was my middle school art teacher. And even though the other teachers didn't know what to do with my intersex body, my gender diversity, my queerness. He saw it, and it didn't matter to him. He also saw my compulsion for art making. So he knew that the other students tormented me, but he could never catch them in the act. So that one time that I finally stood up for myself and I took a big glob of blue paint and smeared it on the face of my attacker, he wrote us both up and sent us both to the principal at the same time. See, he knew that the art room was right next to the stairway, the only one in the school that didn't have cameras. And I beat the shit out of that kid. Just make something. That's what he told me. See, he recognized that my ability, my talent, my interest in art was different than the other students. So when everyone else was learning about primary and tertiary colors, I got my own curriculum. A 30-inch by 40-inch canvas. And I made an oil pastel, what would be seen as a reimagining of the birth of Venus, a painting that I'd never seen before. Have you ever been to an art museum? He asked me, and I said no, and he was surprised because I'd really never seen any art other than the landscapes on a doctor's office wall. Can I take your kid to an art museum? Is what he said when he called up my parents. I promise you it won't be weird. My girlfriend will be with us and you can come too if you want. They didn't want to go. He took me to an art museum. The Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the very first time I'd ever seen art in a gallery. And 3 years later, I got my very first artist residency with Diverse Books.
Lovey Olivia was originally going to be here, and at the last minute, she couldn't make it, but she sent this in her stead. It's a poem from Pat Parker. I am the black woman. I am the child of the sun, the daughter of the dark. I carry fire to burn the wood. I am water to quench its throat. I am the product of slaves. I am the offspring of queens. I am still as silence. I flow as the stream. So, in honor of Lovey and Pat Parker, when we're done in just a little bit, we'll keep the fire going for a few minutes. If you want to come up and stand in the smoke, breathe a little in, get a little in your clothes, take home the scent with you, you're welcome to. Or if you need to stand in it for a minute until the smoke clouds your vision and you start to cry. I've been wondering if there's something useful in that physiological feedback, the smoke-stung tears, when you can't even find the folks to remember, when you're not even sure where to start looking.
We want to gather all of our friends in Arkansas together around a campfire to tell all of these unprovable knowns, like a bunch of queer Northwestern Arkansas ghost stories. All the things that they always heard but could never prove. The beautiful and warm to the harrowing and to the tragic. All of our ghosts. We want to collect them all and spin them into ballads. A queer Ozarks folklore, an origin story. We're going to close tonight with a ballad that Nick and I wrote. Some of it's true, some of it's not. Nothing in it is true with a capital T. Nobody told us these things, or if they did, they didn't tell it like this. Chris is a kid, 19, 20. He used to work at the Sears. When he was really a kid, he figured he'd be a train conductor. He could just picture it. But it turns out you gotta live in a terminal town, which makes sense if you think about it. You gotta live where the train starts and where the train ends. When he was a kid, he would take a flashlight and run at night down a trail where the tracks used to be, holding the flashlight perfectly steady. And he could picture, as if from above, the way his light lit the trees and blasted the rock walls, a ghost train headlamp. When he stopped working at the Sears and started working at the Quick Trip, his manager, who was a white guy, touched his hand while showing him how to restock, and that was that. And while they never told anyone, everyone who worked there knew. One night, when they were walking after work and sharing cigarettes, Chris's manager pointed at an empty billboard and said, "I remember when that said, 'Love thy neighbor.' I loved that." And then he told Chris that he loved him, and Chris said, "Okay, come with me." And before they got into Chris's car, Chris gathered some wild larkspur, and they went to where there was a marker, like for a child's grave, and Chris laid the larkspur there, and his manager asked whose grave that was, and Chris said, "There isn't a person there. It was a gesture that I liked, and the people who put that there made a gesture that I liked, and I believe in gestures, and if you're going to say things like that to me, I want you to know me." Chris drove him out to the trails and said, "Hold this flashlight and count to 1,000 and then run," holding it real steady. And Chris took off first, and he clambered up the last embankment before the river and looked back to see the ghost train 1,000 counts behind him, running where the tracks used to be. And when they were together, both out of breath, Chris was sobbing because in the oncoming train light, he saw the spirit of someone who he thought he knew who he hadn't seen in a long time. And that spirit looked so angry, pissed off and tearing at branches as he ran in the light. And Chris's boyfriend told him everything was okay, and he sucked him off by the old piers, and Chris didn't tell him about any of the other people who were watching from the trees. Chris had an aunt who lived in Kensett. He went there for Thanksgiving before she died. He and his aunt would sit on the side porch and smoke cigarettes and look at the old train car across the street that Miss lived in. Miss would walk the length of her train car, propped up on cinder blocks, and open and close the curtains one at a time, a slow progression of orange light down one side, up the other. And when his aunt went to bed, Chris went down to the track interchange where the kids and their men who hopped trains would get off and wait. He brought a pack of his aunt's cigarettes to share. They sat on bundled ties on the edge of the rail yard and smoked and talked. A kid who said that his name was Nels asked Chris, "What's your story?" And Chris told him. And the kid looked up at the stars while he was talking, and with his finger he traced out a shape between the stars that had no business being traced. And at the end of Chris telling him, he said, "There you are. I'll see you there always, and I won't forget you." And the freight train they were waiting for came, and the jocker lifted Nels up into an empty chassis and climbed up after him, and they were gone. Chris watched it leave, the rumble of the full cars racketing through his body, and knew that, at least for some time, one punk kid would remember him, and would remember his story the way he told it. "Here's the story I didn't tell you, Nels," thought Chris. This was months later. "Here's the story I didn't tell you that you need to know if you want to remember me. I didn't tell you about the old man who taught me how to whistle. The old man who taught me how to whistle like the train shooting past a depot, and how he told me his story about the years he lived with his man in a train car called the Manitou, and they outran the devil for 7 years until it caught up with them. And I didn't tell you how he never told me why he told me all of this. He just knew I would hold it. And I didn't tell you how I saw him in the light of a flashlight running from Gilbert to the river, but you can't remember me right if you don't know what I know about him. The old man who taught me how to whistle had a telescope that he would set up one night each fall, and he'd take out his charts and he'd point the telescope to a star and he'd look at me and say, 'Tonight, the light coming from that star left its star 65 years ago. It left the star the year that I came here with my man and we outran the devil for 7 years. And the next year he would take it out and he'd find a different star on his chart, and he'd put my eye up to the glass and he'd say, tonight, the light coming from that star left its star 66 years ago. That left the star the year that I came here with my man and we outran the devil for 7 years. And he would collect that light in his eyes, adding it to the last years and the years before that. And he would blink and say, it's a garbage thing to do to hold on to this, but it's what I've got. Chris took the white guy who was his manager at the Quick Trip and also was his boyfriend out to the pylons in the river where there used to be a bridge, with a shoebox filled with old slides that he'd picked up at an old junk store, and a car battery, and a converter, and a slide projector. And they sat naked in the cool water and splashed the slides across the pylons, the stained and moss-grown rocks holding Kodachrome images, living room interiors with wood-paneled walls, convertibles, families standing in front of ranch houses, parades and talent shows, sunsets from decades ago. And Chris said, tell me all the queer stories you heard but you didn't know were true. And he did, as Chris slid through the images. And his manager talked about the two old ladies who had lived together since the war with 2 bedrooms. But one time he went over to fix their computer for them and saw that one of the bedrooms was filled with books, even stacked on top of the bed. And that's how he knew. But he heard that when they were young, they had a motorcycle that they would ride together through the mountains, but he couldn't even remember who had told him that. And he told him about the first guy who ever picked him up, told him that where the parking lot behind the Quick Trip is, there used to be a bar where the queers all went. But this was even before his time, so this was something that he'd been told by someone else, and maybe he was just trying to get him in the mood. And I heard, he said, that there was a Caddo Indian guide who took the explorers up the river, and they were both a boy and a girl, or somewhere in between, or something. And I heard that in the 80s and 90s, when the guys would come back from home with from the big cities sick, there was talk that the spring water could cure them, but people were too scared to let them in the baths. And I heard that all of the old guys who started the historic district were like that, but they'd never say. And Chris said, now tell me all the queer stories you knew were true. But they ran out of slides, and it was fine because his boyfriend couldn't really think of any anyway. Chris made one pilgrimage. It was for the old man who had taught him how to whistle. Long after the old man died, Chris looked up the old man's man who he lived with in the train for 7 years, figured he'd see if he could find him. He knew he'd moved to St. Louis. He found out he had a wife there, and they lived in a neighborhood with deed restrictions that kept blacks out. And eventually they'd moved to Oklahoma, and that's where he died. And so Chris went to the graveyard in Bartlesville, and that was it. He didn't know what he expected, but he didn't find it. Just a graveyard with a guy and his wife in it. And he decided that pilgrimage wasn't a pilgrimage at all. That was trash. And he set out to go on a real one. He went to the antique store, and he said he needed a locomotive headlight. The old man who ran the place didn't have one, but said he'd make some calls, and he pulled out an old rotary phone with a coiled headset cord, and he made a call to Bald Knob, who told him to call Fayetteville, who told him to call Eureka, who told him to call Fort Smith, where someone who Chris imagined to be just as old, connected by a coiled headset cord, said that these 2 old guys had just finished up renovating an old rail car that they bought from Kensett, and just as they finished, someone showed up and claimed to be the rightful owner, and after a few days of back and forth, the new guy burned the car to the ground. But they'd had the headlight and a few other electrical pieces in their shop for rewiring, so those survived, and he bet that they'd sell it cheap to get the taste of the whole thing out of their mouth. When Chris went to pick it up, he stood on the side of the 60-foot-long charred rectangle of dirt in the grass where that train car had been turned into a pyre to something worthless, an idol of money, or a saint of pride, or some shit. Chris took his headlamp in one hand, biting hard on the cord, cutting his teeth through the rubber casing until they clenched the bare wires, igniting the lamp with raw fervor, and carried in the other hand a bouquet of holy items, the heel of a stiletto lost in a bar fight, a joint rolled in paper torn from an old Damron's guide, a sachet of dried grass from a defunct women's commune, and a joyfully filled condom found on a tea room floor, and with his torch and bouquet, he set off down the night path where the rail had once been, and he saw things. He saw off the path in a clearing with a bonfire a never-ending stream of husbands and mothers and brothers and children furtively carrying the documents of their loved ones to the flames, throwing them in never to be seen again. The writings in journals, photos and scrapbooks, carefully preserved love letters, collections of magazines and pamphlets burned down to anonymous ash. And he sees, and he sees, he sees, he sees. And eventually, exhausted on the trail, unable to go any further, he hears the whistle of a train behind him, coming down the tracks, now in place. And he sees the wrought iron observation porch of a luxury car with gold lettering, M and NA, with his old man reaching out a hand to pull him into the warmth of the coal-heated, lavishly carpeted sitting room where he sits across from Wellington Stevenson, his old man's man. And one of them says, "I hope you'll eat with us. We've been looking forward to having you." And he says, "The pleasure is all mine," and wanders through the car, past the bedroom with mussed sheets, and the kitchen overflowing with a banquet's worth of dishes, to the rear observation deck, and out back he can see the devil whirling in the wake of the train. And here's what the devil looks like. And over dinner they talked about literature and religion and money, and they pored over registers of numbers and figures and amounts as Wellington's eyes glowed with a zealot's fervor and Jesse's glassed over. A look that Chris heard loud and clear to say, "You better not say anything. These numbers and lines and accounts are the castle walls that protect us, that buffer the waves of fury outside of these ironclad walls." And later, when they were alone, Jesse spoke of those books of numbers and figures and amounts. It's our deal with that whirling devil out back. Once those numbers start flowing, it will do as it pleases. And over the course of a long night of stories, Chris checks back in again and again with the registers, and he sees the numbers slide. And as they decrease, black turns to red, and red ink slowly fills the pages, and the whirling devil out back subsumes the car in a flood of faces, of town people and pastors and newspaper men pressing against the glass of the window until the pressure is too great and they explode in, ripping their way through the spectacular car, pulling Wellington into a locust swarm of arms and teeth that carry him away north towards Missouri, while a second mob, laughing and jeering, envelops Jesse and Chris, ripping them from the car and depositing them on the receding track behind, tearing each vestige of luxury from their bodies. Now empty of its 7-year tenants, the car comes back into focus, and the devil whirlwind settles down, arranging itself quietly in each car and bed and walkway, as calm, no-nonsense sort of salt of the earth good old boys and church-going ladies. Chris runs after the train car that was once called the Manitou, and it stays just beyond his reach, now with a new coat of paint, now with its gold letters melted down to pay debts, now sold by equally respectable townsfolk to another line, now another line, and now, when it is no longer serviceable, to a lady in Kensett who retires it on cinder blocks, sinking into her railroad palace fantasy. But some nights, in the late fall, she hears voices outside of the windows, the sounds of men making love, and she opens a curtain, and the sounds move a bit further away, and she opens the next, and the next, and the next, chasing the sounds of long-vanished lovers around the perimeter of her fantasy. And as Chris catches up at last to this scene, his feet blistered and bleeding, his hands still clutching the headlight, now flickering a glowing red, his sacred bouquet rattling and shaking, he sees his aunt across the way waving goodbye to the lady as the train car is hoisted onto a flatbed trailer and slowly driven to Fort Smith, with a couple of recovering junkies driving a couple of worn-down, borrowed sedans festooned with oversized load banners taped haphazardly on the back, and dollar store orange pennants stuck out of their windows, escorting it to its final resting place. Chris rides to Fort Smith, holding onto the underside of the train's chassis along with Nels, who pulls out a stack of note cards from his breast pocket and asks him question after question. Where has he been? What has he seen? What does he know? And Chris thinks, this isn't for you. This isn't for people who write things down. It doesn't work like that. And he says, I'll tell you everything, Nels. I'll tell you everything I know. Make sure that you write it down good. And when they arrive at Fort Smith, and the driver of the truck and the two drivers of the sedans shake hands with the old railroad buffs who bought the train car, Chris introduces himself and says, my name is Chris, and I think I meant to have this railroad car. It used to have gold letters, and I loved the men who lived in it. And one of the old railroad buffs pulls out a phone and calls his cousin, the sheriff in town, and the other calls his cousin, who's just a cousin, and says, I think we need some help down at the yard. There's a stranger trying to stir up some kind of trouble. And so Chris runs into the woods, shaking his bouquet rattle and gritting his teeth to keep his lantern blazing. And he dances in the woods with a coven of drag queens who tear their wigs off and whip them through the air, churning up a vortex that surrounds Chris with another whirling demon. Only this one keeps him dancing and dancing and dancing and dancing. And the sun eventually rises, and Chris emerges from the woods onto the shoulder of a small highway. He sees his reflection in the plate glass of a Quick Trip, and he recognizes himself, and he says, I see you. You. I see you. And he arrives back at the yard where the two old railroad buffs have completed their years-long restoration with faux gold-painted letters and replica pressed wainscoting and hardware and fixtures and red, white, and blue bunting draped along the observation deck and a ribbon ready to be cut over the front door. The two old railroad buffs walk towards Chris with cell phones in hand, and they ask how they can help him, and he says, I own this car, and I'll take it back now. And they say, what's your name, son? And he says, Jesse. And they say, you're mistaken, Jesse. We've got the title up in the office. And Jesse says, that title means nothing. This car was stolen by the devil, and I'm taking it back. And one of the men says, well, here in Sebastian County, we like to go with what the papers say. And Jesse shakes his bouquet, first in the face of one old man, and then in the face of another, and he says, smell that. And as he walks away shaking his bouquet, he says, I'll be back tonight to take the car, and y'all can use that time to pack up your things. And when he returns, the old men are there, and so are their cousins. And it's hard to tell how many cousins there are. They make a crowd of men and women, the bewildered curiosity in their eyes barely masking that thing underneath, that roiling furnace in which Jesse can see, oh, you've done this before. All it will take is a spark to unleash a holocaust. And as Jesse walks around the crowd toward the back of the Manitou, one of the old men says, now listen, we don't want any trouble here. And the eyes of the cousins flicker, and Jesse untapes the ribbon over the door, and he climbs into the dark car. He sinks his teeth into the cord of his locomotive lamp, and he makes his way through each room meticulously restored. And he passes down one side of the car as the cousins outside follow the light of the locomotive lamp as it illuminates the frosted glass of one window, and then the next, and then the next, and they see the stranger's shadow framed in each consecutive window, and then they're almost sure that they see another shadow join him, inspecting each room one at a time, heads tossed back, laughing and laughing. The two shadows enter the bedroom and close the door behind them, just a sliver of light under the door, an intensifying glow turning orange and red, and then, with a fantastic roar, erupting in flames through the door, licking fire down the hallway of the car, biting into each consecutive room, whipping across the carpets and scrambling up the curtains, and for a brief moment illuminating all of the windows of the car at once. A suspended moment of glorious beauty, shattered by exploding glass and heat, and the windows blown out, showering glass over the cousins who finally back away to watch as the rail car burns and burns. A 60-foot-long pyre to a man whose last name has been lost to history, leaving in its footprint a pile of anonymous ash, doused in fire truck water, and then slowly blown away. Because there was no wind. The smoke of your letters hung in the air for a long time, and its shape was the shape of your face.
Thank you all so much.